the United States position is.
Out over the weekend that the Secretary had spoken with Foreign
Mr.
Minister
Lavrov.
Lavrov and asked to be updated on progress of the talks in Moscow this week. Have they spoken at all today since the Secretary's been in Geneva?
They haven't spoken today. I will tell you that their conversation was really focused on Ukraine. It was briefly at the end about the upcoming meetings in Moscow.
So does he expect to be briefed at the end of the talks? Because they're 2 or 3 day talks, aren't they?
Sure, I expect they'll talk in the coming days. I don't have anything set in terms of time or anything like that.
How did those conversations on Ukraine go?
Yes. How did they go?
How did they go?
Well, I think you're familiar with our view on Ukraine and certainly the events over the past couple days. And we put out a statement, but let me just reiterate some of the important points included there. We join our European counterparts in condemning in the strongest terms this weekend's horrific assault by Russia-backed separatists on civilian neighborhoods in Mariupol and a peaceful city 25 kilometers outside of the Minsk ceasefire line using Grad rocket systems and other advanced weaponry. OSCE monitors have confirmed at least 30 dead, including women, children, and the elderly. It is reprehensible that the separatists are publicly glorifying this and other offensives in blatant breach of the Minsk agreements they signed. And let's be clear, this wasn't in the statement, but I think it's been widely reported. The shelling of Mariupol was conducted by Russian-backed separatists on a peaceful city. As I mentioned, the shelling cost the lives of 30 innocent civilians. While Russia talks about peace, the separatists they support continue to kill, and we continue to believe that they will be judged on their actions, not just on their words. The OSCE has also confirmed the shelling came from separatist territory, as has been widely reported in major media outlets as well.
President Putin seems to have a different view of it. He's blaming the Ukrainian government for all of the latest violence. Do you share that opinion?
Well, I think not only do we not share that opinion isn't shared by the OSCE, which has confirmed the shelling came from separatist territory, and I think it's clear what happened here.
So I'm just trying to understand what's been the effect then of all this diplomacy, including these latest discussions on Ukraine, if essentially you're having even worse violence and a completely different view of everything that you hold for reality here.
Well, I think one of the impacts of what the steps we've taken, which isn't the negotiations, has certainly been a dramatic impact on the Russian economy. And we've seen fits and starts of abiding by the Minsk protocols. Obviously not enough. We remain and continue to have a range of tools at our disposal. Secretary Liu spoke about this today in Europe, and I believe European leaders have said the same exact thing. We continue to believe that abiding by the Minsk protocols and the path that has been laid out there is the interest of Russia, it's in the interest of Ukraine, it's in the interest of everybody involved in this process.
The President himself said in his State of the Union address the other day that the effect of you and the EU sanctions policy has been to leave the Russian economy in tatters. But that doesn't even seem to have convinced President Putin at all to pull back his forces, to stop his backing for the Russian separatists. Destroying the economy of Moscow, or Russia rather, doesn't really seem to be helping to stop the war in Ukraine.
Well, as I mentioned, there have been some fits and starts. There have been agreements. The issue is implementing and abiding by the agreements. And as I mentioned, there are also more tools at our disposal. I don't have anything to announce or predict for you, but that's something that we continue to discuss with our European counterparts as well.
And can I just ask, there's been some reporting out of eastern Ukraine about the measures that Kiev have taken, including such as sort of a no-travel policy, and they've stopped medicines going into that part of Ukraine. It seems that the residents who are caught between the Russian-backed separatists and the Kiev authorities and I just wondered if you had any opinion about whether Kiev should actually allow things like medication and stuff through to the residents who need it.
Well, let me look into this with our team and the specific details of it. Obviously, I've seen some of the reporting, but I just want to get a little bit more of the facts, and we'll get you a response.
Okay.
Jim?
Ukraine?
Staying in Ukraine. Is it the administration's position that the Ukrainian government has committed no violations at all of the Minsk Accords?
Well, I think, as we've said, we expect both sides to abide by the Minsk protocols. I don't have anything. I'm not going to use a straw man on accusing them of not abiding by it. I haven't seen accusations out there that they haven't.
Well, they're all over the place. And,
But from the Russian side,
Well,
when
right,
it's been
but I mean-
disproven by the OSCE and other independent monitors?
well, surely there must be some violations by, there has to be some violations by both sides. It's not just one side that's fighting here, right?
Well, certainly, as I mentioned last week, and we had a similar discussion, Matt.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, we would ask both sides and call on both sides to prevent civilian casualties. We'd call on both sides to
Right.
abide by the Minsk protocols. That doesn't change the fact that Ukraine has completed and made significant progress on abiding, while as Russia and the Russian-backed separatists have not.
Well, I understand but you have not, that I can recall yet, accused or condemned any action by the government of Kiev, the government in Kiev, for violations which you say, or I don't know. I mean, are there no violations on the
Well,
the
this
government
sounds
side?
similar to what Russia Today was asking last week.
Well, right, but I mean, if you
Is there a
look,
specific violation that we're talking about that we should discuss?
the U.S. is very quick to condemn the separatist side and for violations of the Minsk agreement. And your allegations about them, which may or may not, which you say have been proven by the OSCE, are fine. But the Russians make their own allegations. And you're saying that all of those are flat out wrong?
Well,
and all of
they're
yours
standing
are 100%?
alone while the rest of the international community is
Correct.
on the other side with a different understanding of what's happening.
Okay, there have been in the Russian media has made a big deal out of apparently some fighter from the Ukrainians who speaks fluent English and suggesting that there are U.S. mercenaries or U.S. troops operating with the Kiev government. Can you speak to that? Is that not true? Is that?
There are not U.S. troops operating. There was also an accusation that there was a NATO legion in Ukraine,
Right.
which NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg has spoken to. So there have been a range of rumors out there which are inaccurate. And again, if there is a specific violation that Ukraine is being accused of, I'm happy to discuss that.
Well,
But
there was the bus incident.
of which there's an investigation into it, and we made clear that we would condemn either side being responsible.
Okay.
Are you aware of private armies that operate in the Ukraine?
There have been rumors of that, which my understanding is they're false, Saeed.
Okay,
So
and let me ask you about the Minsk protocol.
Mm-hmm.
Is there like a watchdog group that determines who violated what when?
well, the OSCE
Okay.
is an international organization that is there monitoring a range of actions and inactions in Ukraine.
And do you have like a balance sheet on this thing?
Well, I would point you to the OSCE. I think they've spoken to that as well. Any more in Ukraine before we continue? Go ahead, Pam.
You mentioned that the U.S. and its allies have more tools at their disposal in terms of responding to Russia, but specifically with the State Department, considering that Russia has stepped up its attacks and also its rhetoric and its accusations, what's being done on the diplomatic front to address these concerns directly with Russia? Is the State Department looking at, or has the State Department implemented any new tactics, any new approaches in its response to Russia?
Well, there are a range of things that are happening at the same time. As I think we've discussed a little bit and we put out a readout of, the Secretary spoke with Foreign Minister Lavrov just yesterday. So obviously that's a part of our diplomatic effort in terms of outreach. There are ongoing meetings. There's an EU meeting on Ukraine this week. That is for them to discuss where things stand and have a discussion about that internally. We of course stay in lockstep with them. There have been a range of meetings. There was a meeting in Berlin, which the United States wasn't a part of, but we're in close touch with all of the participants in. And for any decision made in the administration, whether it's sanctions or otherwise, we're part of an interagency process of determining that. So anything that is done as it relates to our policy with Ukraine is something that we would weigh into and be a part of the decision making on.
President Putin. I mean, with respect to the Secretary and his efforts with with Minister Lavrov, in the past months, State Department officials have conceded that, Minister Lavrov doesn't actually hold the power in this dossier. So is anybody speaking to President Putin about it?
Well, I think you would know if there were conversations between President Obama and President Putin, which would be the proper channel for that. There have been over the course of time. I obviously don't have anything new to read out for you. There are other officials we work, I shouldn't say just officials, government leaders we work closely with around the world, whether that's Chancellor Merkel or others who have had conversations and engaged with President Putin as well.
But it does seem that currently the the US diplomacy on this is stalemated, that it's not, in fact, the fighting is getting worse. A year ago, almost, we had the annexation of Crimea, and now we've got almost full-out war in eastern Ukraine.
Well, I don't agree with that. I think, one, obviously, we're concerned about the violence over the past couple of days, but it's inaccurate to say diplomacy is stalemated. It's not just the United States. In fact, many of these negotiations and discussions we're not a part of. They're happening with European leaders. There were meetings just last week in Berlin where there were discussions and agreements that came out of it. Those are ongoing. So there are several different diplomatic efforts that have been ongoing and will certainly continue, that will be engaged in one way or the other.
So is this something that's better left to the Europeans, do you feel?
I think there are times when it's appropriate for those discussions to be with European leaders. There are times when the United States is involved. Our efforts and our goals remain the same.
And just two very brief things on this. One, over the weekend, the Security Council was unable to reach agreement on a statement that would have condemned the violence in Ukraine. I'm wondering if you have any comment on that or why that happened.
I think we saw where Russia stood on that statement, so that's why that happened. But in terms of the language in it or the effort behind it, obviously, as you know, that was something we supported, and it's similar to condemning as we have done publicly.
Right, but you don't see that as your resistance. I mean, there's two ways to look at it. One is that Russia was pushing to get language that it wanted in there, and you guys refused. Or the other side, the other way to look at it is that you had language that you wanted, and Russia refused to agree to it. The reason that I bring this up is it goes back to the earlier question, which is my understanding of what the Russians wanted in there was condemnation of both sides, or of killings committed by both sides. And if you guys refuse to have that language in there, it suggests that you don't believe that there are any violations by the Ukrainian government. Now, that may or may not be true, but is that, I mean, does it suggest that you don't think that there have been violations of the Minsk Accord on both sides?
I'm just not going to speak to hypotheticals, Matt. Obviously, we continue to.
But it's not a hypothetical.
But you're using a straw man as if I should just condemn or violations that only the Russians have accused the Ukrainians of. If there's a specific violation, then let's talk about it.
All right,
And
well, I mean,
it's also divorced from the reality of what's happening on the ground, which is the preponderance of attacks, the preponderance of violence is happening from the Russian side.
Well, all right, preponderance, but that's not all. Preponderance is not all, and so I think that it might not be a bad idea to have to look at it with to even it out a little bit if it comes close to if it even comes close to being even. So you're suggesting that
close to being even.
Okay, but it doesn't merit a mention at all. That's the.
Look,
I guess that's the question.
We're
the other
talking.
thing,
Go ahead.
it's totally different.
Okay.
The other thing, well, it's not totally different, but do you have the Standard & Poor's has just cut the Russian bond rating to junk levels? Is this the kind of thing that you think is good and helps put pressure on the Russians and follows with what President Obama said about their economy being in tatters?
Well, first, I think President Obama's lines in the State of the Union were about what the results have been of the actions that we've taken. It wasn't that our goal is to have a negative impact on the Russian economy. Our goal is to have a peaceful resolution to the situation in Ukraine. So certainly we've seen that our sanctions have had an impact. The impact of the European sanctions has had an impact, and this may be one of the latest examples of that.
Okay, but you don't have anything specific on this?
I don't have anything specific.
We're
No.
talking about specific that Matt was Moscow saying that where Kiev has been particularly broken, its word is that it's refused to pull back its heavy weapons from the front and negotiate directly with the rebels.
Well, one, I think we all know that the rebels have been invited, the Russian-backed separatists, to a variety of different meetings by the Ukrainian government. So that's just false. The second piece is Ukraine is a sovereign country. Russia has heavy weaponry, has materials, has individuals who are in Ukraine and on the border of Ukraine violating the sovereignty of their country. Do they have the right to defend themselves? Absolutely they do. And putting the two in the same category is ludicrous.
Under the Minsk Accord, are they not required to at least pull back from the Minsk separation line, their heavy weaponry?
Well, but again, remember why we're in the situation we're in. Are we expecting they're going to pull back when the Russians are not, when it's talking about defending their own territory?
No, I know we're getting into a chicken and an egg situation, but neither side has fulfilled its requirements. Is that correct?
Well, but I think the context of it is incredibly important here as to why we're in the situation we're in. Go
Well,
ahead.
I just wanted to clarify
Oh.
something that you just said. You're saying that there are Russian arms and heavy equipment inside the Ukraine?
Well, we've seen Russian-backed separatists using a range of equipment.
Yeah,
Yes,
but
we've
not
seen
Russian
all
backed
that.
separatists. I mean, actual Russian
Russian-backed
units and heavy.
separatists. I think we're moving on from this topic. Do we have anything new? Yes,
to
go ahead.
to the Philippines.
Okay.
We've been asking